The air in the Grand Sept was thick with lilies and lies. 5 years of them. King Darius Halwyn stood at the altar, a statue carved from grief and iron, the gold circlet on his brow, feeling more like a brand than a crown. Every candle flame trembled in the cold draught, casting dancing shadows on the stone pillars that had witnessed the Halwyn line swear their vows for 1,000 years. He was about to swear his own, a second time. The thought was a shard of glass in his gut. They told him it was for the kingdom. They told him it was time. 5 years, they'd whispered, was long enough for any man to mourn, even a king for his chosen Luna. But the wolf inside him knew better. Grief had no timeline. It was a territory, a vast and desolate landscape he walked alone every night. His wolf had not truly stirred since the day he'd laid her in the frozen earth. Now it lay sleeping, a slumbering beast of memory and loss. This ceremony was a betrayal of that sacred sleep. His bride, Lady Isolde, stood beside him, a vision of pristine white silk and carefully arranged pearls. She was beautiful, dutiful, and her hand in his was clammy with nervous reverence. Her scent was faint, clean, like fresh linen in rain. It was a perfectly acceptable scent for a queen, but it was not the scent of home. It was not the scent of wild mountain roses in winter frost. The scent that was etched into his soul. The scent of Orin. The high priest raised his hands, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. A drone of ancient words about duty, lineage, and the blessing of the moon goddess. Darius's gaze drifted over the assembled court, a sea of carefully neutral faces. He saw the pity in the eyes of his beta Ronin, standing grimly to his right. He saw the smug satisfaction on the faces of the council elders who had pushed for this union. They saw a king finally moving on. He saw a man hollowing himself out to make room for a crown that grew heavier each year. The priest's words faded into a meaningless hum. Darius was no longer in the sept. He was back on the bluffs under a bleeding moon, the coppery tang of Orin's blood on his lips. He remembered the prophecy that had been a shadow over their love, the one that claimed the Alpha King's strength would be sealed only when his truest mate was given to the earth. He had laughed at it, called it an old crone's tale, but the prophecy had taken her anyway, a fever that stole her breath on the very night they were to be wed. He could still feel the phantom weight of her in his arms, her last shuddering breath a ghost against his cheek. He had buried her in her wedding gown, a promise sealed in death instead of life. A cold, furious wind suddenly swept through the sept, extinguishing a dozen candles in a single collective hiss. The air grew frigid. A collective gasp rippled through the pews. The tapestries depicting great hunts and ancient battles billowed like angry sails. The high priest faltered, his chant dying in his throat. And then came the sound. A low, grating groan, like a stone sarcophagus being pushed open from the inside. The great oak doors at the back of the hall, barred with a beam of iron for the ceremony, trembled in their frames. Every head, every pair of eyes, turned. Silence, thick and absolute, descended. The only sound was the frantic, terrified thumping of Darius's own heart, a drumbeat calling out to something in the sudden dark. The iron bar lifted, not by any hand, but as if repelled by an unseen force. It clattered to the stone floor with a deafening clang that made half the court jump. Slowly, with the agonizing deliberation of a nightmare unfolding, the doors swung inward. A figure stood silhouetted against the bruised twilight sky. For a heartbeat, it was just a shape, a trick of the light, but the scent hit him first, an impossible, devastating wave that shattered the 5 years of his carefully constructed emptiness. It wasn't a memory, it was real. Wild roses and the biting chill of the first winter frost. It was her. She took a step into the candlelight, and the court's unified gasp was stolen from their lungs. Lady Isolde made a small strangled sound and stumbled back, her hand flying from Darius's arm as if burned. The high priest dropped his gilded ceremonial book. It was Orin. She was pale, her skin like moonlight on snow, but it was her. Her silver-gray eyes, once warm and full of life, now burned with an ancient, chilling fire. She wore her wedding gown, or what was left of it. The fine lace was torn, stained with dirt, and what looked like dried blood, clinging to her form like a burial shroud. A single withered wild rose was clutched in her hand. She was not a ghost. Ghosts did not smell of earth and memory. Ghosts did not make the wolf inside him, the one that had slept for half a decade, awaken with a guttural, possessive roar that shook him to his very bones. Her eyes scanned the hall, sweeping over the terrified faces of the nobles, over the trembling bride at the altar, and then they found his. In that gaze, he saw everything: the night of the blood moon, the cold darkness of the grave. A promise made and a promise broken. She took another silent step, and another, her bare feet making no sound on the cold stone floor. The crowd parted before her like water, a wave of raw primal fear clearing her path to the altar. Time ceased to exist. There was no wedding, no engdom, no duty. There was only the woman walking toward him from the grave, his mate, his Luna, his greatest failure and his deepest love, returned from the unforgiving earth. Ronan put a hand on his arm, a silent warning, but Darius shook him off. Isolde whispered his name, a fragile, pleading sound. Darius? He didn't hear her, he couldn't. All he could hear was the frantic, impossible beat of his own heart and the howling of his soul. He moved, descending the altar steps, his legs carrying him forward on instinct alone. The king was gone. The grieving widower was gone. All that remained was the alpha whose mate had just walked back into the world. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to see the flecks of soil on her pale cheeks, close enough to feel the impossible cold that radiated from her skin. Her burning gaze held him captive. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The air crackled with 5 years of unspoken words, of rage and sorrow and a bond that death itself had failed to sever. From his throat, a sound escaped. Not a word, but a raw, broken utterance of disbelief and agony. A name that was both a prayer and a curse. Oren. His voice, her name, hung in the frozen air between them, a bridge across an abyss of 5 impossible years. Oren did not move, did not blink. Her gaze held him pinned, a hunter's focus on its prey. The burning in her eyes was not fury, not yet. It was something deeper, a centuries-old reckoning that had taken root in the darkness of the earth and had now, finally, broken through the surface. The collective shock of the court shattered. A woman screamed. A nobleman near the back fainted, his armored weight crashing to the stone with a dull thud. The high priest, his face pale and slack with horror, finally found his voice. It was a reedy, trembling thing, laced with superstitious terror. "Abomination!" he shrieked, pointing a quaking finger at Oren. "A revenant! A shade conjured by dark forces to profane this holy union. Guards, seize this creature!" The command was an absurdity. The royal guards, wolves sworn to the Halwyn line, were rooted to the spot, their hands on their pommels but their eyes wide with the same primal fear that had seized the rest of the pack. They could smell it just as Darius could. She was not a ghost. She was flesh, blood, and something more. The ancient, undeniable scent of a Luna, twisted by the grave but still potent, still real, overpowered the cloying lilies and incense. It was a scent that commanded respect, not violence. Darius's wolf, now fully awake and raging against the cage of his ribs, answered the priest's decree with a snarl that was felt more than heard. It was a low, guttural vibration of pure, undiluted alpha authority that rolled through the sept and rattled the very stones. "Silence," Darius commanded. The word was not loud, but it carried the weight of a king and the threat of a beast. The high priest's mouth snapped shut, his eyes bulging. Every whisper, every shuffle of silk and leather ceased. The hall was once again plunged into a silence so profound it was suffocating. He took another step toward her, closing the remaining distance. The cold emanating from her was a physical presence, seeping into his bones. It was the chill of a crypt, of sunless earth and forgotten things. He could see the fine, dark soil caught in the frayed lace of her sleeves, the way the tattered hem of her gown was damp, as if she had walked through miles of dewy, moonlit grass to get here. He lifted a hand, his fingers trembling slightly. His mind screamed at him, "This is wrong, this cannot be." But his soul, his very wolf, pushed him onward. He had to know. He had to touch her. His fingertips brushed against her cheek. The contact was a bolt of lightning through his system. Her skin was cold, shockingly so, like marble that had been left out in the winter frost. But beneath the cold, there was a thrum, a faint, deep pulse of energy, of life, of something that had no name. It was not the warmth he remembered, the vibrant heat of the living, breathing woman he had loved. This was different, older, wilder. As his skin met hers, the frayed, dormant thread of their mating bond flared to life. It was not the brilliant golden cord of their past. It was a tangled, ghostly thing, thin and sharp as a spider's silk, yet it pulled at his soul with an agony of recognition. It was there. It was her. A shudder went through Oren's frame at his touch. Her eyes, which had been fixed on his with that unnerving intensity, finally flickered. The hard, ancient fire softened for a barest fraction of a second, and in its place, he saw a glimmer of the woman he had buried. He saw pain, he saw confusion. He saw love so fierce it had clawed its way back from death. "It cannot be," Lady Isolde choked out from behind him. Her voice, sharp with hysteria and humiliation, broke the spell. "She is dead! Darius, this is a trick, a curse!" Her father, Lord Valerius, a hard-faced man whose ambition was barely masked by courtly grace, stepped forward, his expression thunderous. "King Darius, what is the meaning of this spectacle? My daughter has been dishonored. This thing, must be removed." Darius did not turn. He did not take his eyes off Oren. Without looking away from her, he spoke, his voice dangerously low. "This spectacle, Lord Valerius, is the return of my Luna. The wedding is void." A wave of scandalized gasps washed over the hall. He could feel the outrage, the disbelief. Isolde let out a sob of pure, wounded fury. But Darius felt nothing for them. The world had narrowed to this single point, to the cold-skinned woman standing before him, smelling of his past and an unknowable future. He curled his fingers, gently cradling her jaw, his thumb stroking the curve of her cheek. She leaned into his touch almost imperceptibly, a silent surrender. "Ronan," Darius said, his voice ringing with command. His beta was at his side in an instant, his own shock now masked by fierce, unquestioning loyalty. "Alpha. Clear the sept, escort Lady Isolde and her family to their chambers. No one leaves the castle grounds. Post guards at every gate. I want the entire citadel on lockdown until I have answers." He finally pulled his gaze from Oren, sweeping it over the stunned, frightened faces of his court. "No one is to speak of what they saw here tonight. The penalty for spreading rumors will be absolute. Is that understood?" A ragged chorus of assent answered him. He was their king, their alpha. Even faced with the impossible, they bent to his will. Ronan began barking orders, and the guards, grateful for the direction, moved to herd the bewildered nobles out of the great hall. Darius turned his full attention back to Oren. He slid his hand from her cheek to her arm, his fingers wrapping around the tattered sleeve of her gown. He half expected his hand to pass through her, but her arm was solid, real. He tugged gently. "Come with me." She did not resist. She moved when he moved, a silent, graceful wraith at his side. He led her from the altar, past the sputtering candles, and the overturned book of vows, down the central aisle, where another bride should have walked. The whispers followed them like rustling leaves, dead, revenant, curse, the prophecy. But he ignored them all. He led her not to their old shared chambers. He couldn't bear that, not yet. But to a private solar deep within the royal wing, a place of solitude with a great stone hearth and windows that overlooked the silent, brooding forest. He pushed the heavy door open and guided her inside, shutting it firmly behind them, sealing them away from the chaos and the fear. The room was lit only by the low fire crackling in the hearth. The flames cast a warm orange glow, making the shadows dance. For the first time since she had appeared, Oren's gaze left his. Her eyes swept the room, taking in the heavy tapestries, the carved furniture, the faint scent of wood smoke and old leather. There was a flicker of something in her expression, familiarity, perhaps, or the disorientation of a dream. He released her arm, a strange reluctance coiling in his gut. Now that they were alone, the magnitude of it all crashed down on him. The king receded, and the man, the broken-hearted mate, was left raw and exposed. He felt a tremor start in his hands, a desperate need for answers that felt like a physical thirst. "Oren," he breathed, his voice cracking. "How? By the gods, how are you here?" She turned back to him, the firelight catching in her silver-gray eyes, making them glow like embers. She looked at him for a long, silent moment, and he had the unnerving sensation that she was seeing not just him, but everything he had done, every moment of the 5 years she had been gone. She saw the grief, the duty, the loneliness, and the betrayal at the altar. When she finally spoke, her voice was nothing like he remembered. The warm, melodic cadence was gone. This voice was a rasp, a whisper of wind through dry leaves, rough with disuse and imbued with the chilling echo of the grave. "The prophecy," she whispered, each word seeming to cost her a great effort. "You never understood it." "I understood that it killed you," he said, his own voice harsh with pain. A slow, sad smile touched her lips, a ghostly imitation of the one he cherished in his memories. "It didn't kill me, Darius. It preserved me. The earth took me as a debt, a promise. I was to sleep, anchored to your heart, until the bloodline was in true peril." He stared at her, his mind reeling, trying to make sense of her cryptic words. "Peril? The kingdom is at peace. The bloodline is secure." Her eyes hardened, the ancient fire returning. "Is it?" She took a deliberate step toward him, her gaze dropping to the place over his heart where their bond resonated, faint and twisted. "You stood at an altar and prepared to give your name, your title, your future, to another. You tried to replace me." Guilt, sharp and sickening, twisted inside him. "It was for the kingdom," he began, but she cut him off. "You broke your promise," she rasped. And now her voice held the edge of a winter storm. She raised a hand, her slender, soil-stained fingers reaching not for his face, but for his chest. "You promised you would wait. That vow held me, your new vow. It was a key. It turned the lock. You woke me up." Her fingertips pressed against the fine wool of his tunic, directly over his heart. No shock of cold this time. Instead, a searing, white-hot energy shot from her touch, straight into his soul. It was a jolt of pure, primal power, a raw taste of the grave, and the wild magic she now wielded. He gasped, stumbling back, the breath punched from his lungs. The room swam before his eyes. He saw flashes, not memories, but feelings, the suffocating darkness, the crushing weight of the earth, the slow, silent passage of seasons overhead, the loneliness, the waiting. He felt a sliver of her 5 years in the dark, and the agony of it nearly brought him to his knees. As the vision faded, he looked up, breathing heavily. The effort, it seemed, had taken its toll on her. The fiery intensity in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a profound weariness. Her pale face grew even paler, and a faint tremor started in her limbs. She swayed on her feet, her expression clouded with exhaustion. "Oren," he said, his voice sharp with alarm. She looked at him, her lips parting as if to say more, but no sound emerged. Her eyes, which had held so much fire and fury, rolled back in her head. Her body went limp, and she crumpled forward, a broken doll in a ruined dress. He lunged, catching her before she hit the floor, sweeping her into his arms. The impossible weight of her, so much more real and solid than a ghost, was a shock all over again. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her cold cheek pressing against his neck. The scent of wild roses, damp earth, and something ancient and unknowable filled his senses, a devastating perfume of love and death. He held the impossible truth in his arms. His dead bride had returned, and he had no idea if he had just saved her or damned them both. He held her. The fragile weight of her in his arms was a devastating paradox, both an anchor and a ghost. For 5 years he had carried her only in memory, a weightless phantom that burdened his soul. Now, the solid reality of her bones, the light pressure of her head against his chest, was almost too much to bear. She was real, she was here, and she was as cold as the marble effigy on her own empty tomb. He carried her across the solar, his movements sure and steady despite the tremor in his core. The fire in the hearth crackled, its warmth a stark contrast to the deathly chill of her skin. He laid her down gently on a long divan covered in thick wolf pelts, the dark fur a stark canvas for her pale form and ruined white gown. For a long moment he simply stood over her, his mind a maelstrom of disbelief, terror, and a fierce, primal possessiveness that stunned him with its ferocity. His wolf, so long dormant, was now pacing the confines of his mind, a restless, snarling guardian. "Mine," it growled, a constant, low thrum, returned. But what had returned? He knelt beside her, his gaze tracing the lines of her face. It was the face he saw every time he closed his eyes, yet it was terrifyingly different. The vibrant life that had once glowed beneath her skin was gone, replaced by a luminous, moon-like pallor. There were fine lines of dirt in the creases beside her eyes and a dark smudge across her high cheekbone. Her lips, which he remembered as soft and quick to smile, were pale and still. This was Orin, but an Orin sculpted by the earth, reshaped by 5 years of silent darkness. He couldn't stand the sight of the grave dirt on her skin. It was a violation, a mark of the tomb on the woman he loved. On a nearby table sat a silver ewer of water and a basin, left for him by a servant hours ago in another lifetime, when he was just a king preparing for a loveless wedding. Now he took a linen cloth, dipped it in the cool water, and wrung it out. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he reached for her. As he gently began to wipe the grime from her cheek, the scent rose from her skin, intensified by the moisture. Wild roses and frost, yes, but now mingled with the rich, loamy smell of deep earth and something else. Something metallic and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike. It was the scent of primal magic. It flooded his senses, bypassed his rational mind, and plunged him headfirst into memory. The wind was sharp on the high ridges of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, whipping her silver-gray hair across her face as she laughed. She was perched on a sun-warmed boulder, a crown of wild roses she'd woven herself sitting askew on her head. He had just bested her in a sparring match. A rare victory, for she was as quick and fierce as any warrior in his retinue, and his prize was to listen to her breathless, triumphant laughter. "You cheated, Darius Halwyn," she'd accused, her eyes sparkling with mirth, not malice. "You used your alpha command to make me hesitate." He had grinned, closing the distance between them. "I used every advantage at my disposal, as a king should." He plucked a petal from her hair, its scent filling the small space between them. "And as your mate should." Her laughter died into a soft smile. She reached out, her hand warm and calloused from her training, and cupped his jaw. Her thumbs stroked the rough stubble there, a simple touch that sent fire through his veins. Her scent was all around him, roses and clean mountain air, and the unique intoxicating perfume of her own skin, warm from the sun and exertion. "My king," she had whispered, her voice full of a love so potent it felt like a physical force. "My mate." Then she had leaned in and kissed him, a kiss that tasted of wind and sunlight, and promises that were meant to last forever. A harsh gasp tore from Darius's throat, yanking him back to the firelit gloom of the solar. The memory was so vivid, so real, he could almost feel the phantom warmth of her lips on his, but the face before him was still and cold. The linen cloth in his hand was now stained with dirt. He had cleaned her face, revealing the impossibly smooth, pale skin beneath. He saw the faint scatter of freckles across her nose he had once loved to trace with his finger. He saw the elegant curve of her brow. She was his Orin. She was a stranger. His heart was a knot of conflicting agonies. The joy of her return was poisoned by the terrifying mystery of it. The instinct to hold her, to protect her, warred with the primal fear of what she had become. The high priest had called her an abomination. His mind recoiled from the word, but a sliver of cold doubt wormed its way in. What magic had brought her back? And what price would it demand? A sharp, authoritative knock sounded at the door. "Darius!" It was Ronan's voice, tight with urgency. Darius froze, his hand hovering over Orin's face. His first, overwhelming instinct was to snarl, to tell him to go away, to leave them sealed in this bubble of impossibility. He felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it bordered on feral. No one would see her like this. No one would touch her. "Darius, I know you're in there. You must open the door. The council has gone mad." He gritted his teeth, forcing the growl back down his throat. Ronan was his beta, his brother in all but blood. He was the only one he could trust. Rising slowly, Darius moved to the door, but did not unbolt it. He pressed his forehead against the cool, heavy oak. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "It's chaos," Ronan said, his voice muffled but clear. "Lord Valerius is demanding your head. He claims you brought a demonic illusion into the sept to publicly dishonor his daughter and break your treaty with the southern lords. Isolde is hysterical, and the high priest, he's worse. He's gathered the acolytes. He's talking about rites of purification, about exorcism, Darius. He says the castle is tainted, and that she must be consecrated by fire. Fire." The word sent a bolt of pure white-hot rage through him. The image of flames touching Oren's skin, of this impossible miracle being turned to ash, was enough to make his vision go red at the edges. "Post my personal guard, the blood guard, at the entrance to this wing," Darius commanded, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. "No one gets through. Not the high priest, not the council, not Valerius, no one. Tell them the king is communing with the spirits of his ancestors and cannot be disturbed on pain of death. Is that clear?" There was a pause on the other side of the door. "And what should I tell them you're communing about?" Ronan asked, a hint of wry desperation in his tone. "Tell them I'm asking for guidance on how to deal with traitors who would dare threaten their returned Luna," Darius snarled. "That should give them something to think about." "I, Alpha," Ronan said, the formal title a clear acknowledgement of the gravity of the command. "It will be done, but Darius? What is she? Is it really her?" The question hung in the air, the same one screaming in his own mind. He looked back at Oren's still form on the divan. The firelight flickered across her face, making it seem as if her expression shifted, softened. "I don't know," Darius admitted, the words feeling like a betrayal. "But she is mine to protect. Go, Ronan, hold the castle." He heard his beta's footsteps recede down the stone corridor. He was alone with her again. The brief intrusion of the outside world had sharpened his focus. The court could descend into chaos, his alliances could crumble, the priests could howl their superstitions. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the woman on the couch, the mystery sleeping in his solar. He walked back to her side, his rage cooling into a grim resolve. He studied her again, and this time, his eyes fell on the withered rose she had been clutching. It had fallen from her limp hand when he laid her down, and now rested on the floor beside the divan. A pathetic, dead thing. As he watched, mesmerized by the flickering light, the withered brown petals of the dead flower trembled. He blinked, thinking it a trick of the firelight, but it happened again. He knelt, his gaze fixed on the dead rose. Slowly, impossibly, one of the centermost petals began to unfurl. It was no longer brown and brittle, but a deep velvety crimson, glistening with a dew that had not been there a second before. It was a single perfect petal of a living rose, blooming from the heart of a dead one. The blooming rose was an impossibility, a single defiant jewel of life born from decay. Darius stared at it, his breath held captive in his lungs. The crimson petal, vibrant and alive, pulsed with a faint inner light, casting a tiny, rosy glow on the stone floor. It was not just living, it was thriving, drawing sustenance from some unseen source. He reached out a hesitant hand, his fingers brushing against the impossible softness of the petal. A warmth, faint but distinct, radiated from it, a complete antithesis to the woman who had dropped it. The connection was immediate, a spark of understanding in the chaos of his mind. The rose was tied to her. This small, impossible life was a reflection of the life, however faint, that still slumbered within Oren. But it was weak, isolated. It was a single candle flame in a vast, encroaching darkness. He looked from the rose to her still form. She lay so silent, a perfect effigy of the woman he had lost. But she wasn't lost. She was here, and she was cold. A deep, instinctual knowledge surfaced within him, a wisdom as old as their shifter blood. The dead do not bloom. Ghosts do not radiate cold. This was something else entirely. She was trapped somewhere between life and death, and the chill that clung to her was the abyss trying to pull her back. He would not let it. He could not leave her in that ruined gown, a shroud of grave dirt and memory. It was a violation. With a resolve that hardened his features, he went to a large oaken chest at the foot of his own bed in the adjoining chamber. He pushed aside his own tunics and cloaks, his fingers searching until they brushed against something soft, carefully wrapped in oilcloth. He pulled it out. It was one of her old sleeping gowns, a simple garment of deep blue wool, spun so finely it felt like silk. He had kept a few of her things, hiding them away from the sympathetic eyes of servants who had tried to purge his chambers of her memory. He had not been able to look at them in 5 years. Now, holding the gown, her faint, lingering scent of roses and home rose from the fabric, a ghostly echo that twisted his heart. Returning to her side, he began the heart-wrenching task of removing the tattered wedding dress. The fabric, once pristine ivory silk, was stiff with dried mud, and tore like old parchment under his gentle but firm hands. As he worked, peeling away the layers of her burial attire, he uncovered the stark reality of her skin. It was flawless, impossibly so, without the slightest blemish or mark of decay, but it was not unmarked. Across her ribs, curling up toward her heart, was a tracery of faint silver lines. They were not scars from any blade he knew. They looked like the delicate, branching pattern of roots, shimmering faintly in the firelight as if etched in moonlight. He traced one with his finger, and the skin beneath was not raised or rough, but smooth and colder than the rest of her. It was a mark of the earth, a claim staked on her flesh. The prophecy had said the earth would take her, and here was the proof. It had left its signature upon her very soul. He worked with a grim, tender reverence, his hands moving with a memory of their own, recalling the shape of her, the curve of her waist, the line of her collarbone. He cleaned her skin with the damp cloth, washing away the last of the grave from her limbs, his touch lingering. Every point of contact was a fresh wave of agony and wonder. He was touching his wife, whom he had buried. He was touching a miracle he could not comprehend. When she was finally free of the ruined gown, he dressed her in the soft blue wool. The deep, vibrant color was a shock against her pallor, making her seem less a corpse and more a figure from a tragic legend, a snow queen asleep under a spell. He gently lifted her head, her silver-gray hair, miraculously clean and untangled, spilling over his arm like a river of moonlight. He arranged it on the dark fur of the pelt, a stark and beautiful halo. With the task done, he knelt beside her again, his hand hovering over her chest, over the place where those root-like scars converged. The cold was still there, a profound, soul-deep chill. He could feel the faint, thrumming energy he'd felt before, a life force so weak it was barely a whisper. The blooming rose. Her life force was like that single petal, small, isolated, struggling. He knew what he had to do. The thought was instinct, not reason. It was the alpha in him, the mate, recognizing a fundamental truth. She was cold because she lacked warmth. She was dim because she lacked light. He had an abundance of both. His life force, the vibrant energy of an alpha king, burned within him like a furnace. He placed his palm flat against her chest, directly over her heart. He closed his eyes, shutting out the flickering firelight, the stone walls, the kingdom at his door. He focused inward, seeking the core of his own being, the wellspring of his strength. He pictured it as a golden sun, burning bright and hot within him. Then, with a will of iron forged by love and grief, he pushed. He sent his warmth, his life, his energy down his arm and into her. The sensation was immediate and shocking. It felt like plunging his hand into a frozen river. A violent, sucking cold leached at him, drawing the heat from his body with a desperate hunger. It was a painful, draining pull, and his first instinct was to recoil, but he fought it. He held his hand steady, grit his teeth, and pushed harder, visualizing his golden light pouring into her, battling the icy darkness. He could feel the faint, thrumming pulse beneath his palm begin to respond, to quicken ever so slightly, like a starving creature receiving its first taste of nourishment. Sweat beaded on his brow. The effort was immense, more taxing than any battle he had ever fought. He felt his own heartbeat laboring as he poured more and more of himself into her. The room began to feel colder as his body heat was siphoned away. Still, he did not stop. He thought of her laughter, of her fierce grip on his hand, of the life that had burned in her eyes. He would not let the grave have her back. He would be her anchor to the world of the living. A sudden, frantic pounding on the door shattered his concentration. "Darius, by the gods, open this door now!" Ronan's voice was raw with panic. The sheer terror in it was enough to make Darius's eyes fly open. He snatched his hand back from Oren's chest as if burned. A wave of dizziness washed over him, the abrupt cessation of the energy transfer leaving him weak and shaking. He had to brace himself against the divan to keep from falling. He staggered to the door, his legs unsteady, and drew the bolt. Ronan practically fell into the room, his face ashen, his chest heaving. Two of the blood guards stood grimly behind him in the corridor, their swords drawn. "What is it?" Darius demanded, his voice raspy. "The High Priest," Ronan gasped, trying to catch his breath. "He's lost his mind. He didn't just rouse the acolytes. He went to the commons. He's preaching to the city." He's telling them a demon wearing the face of their dead Luna has come to claim the throne, to curse the bloodline, and bring about a century of darkness. He's using the prophecy, twisting it. The people are terrified, Darius. They're gathering torches. It's becoming a mob. Darius's blood ran cold. A mob, fueled by religious fanaticism and fear. He had faced armies on the battlefield, but this was a different kind of enemy, a poison that spread within his own walls. And Valerius? Darius ground out. Worse, Ronan said, his eyes dark. He's using the chaos. He's gathered his men-at-arms, nearly 100 of them, and has fortified the southern wing. He sent a message. He's declared the marriage contract broken and claims you're unfit to rule, either mad or consorting with dark powers. He demands you surrender the creature to the high priest for judgment, and that you abdicate in favor of a council he, of course, will lead. It was a coup, a blatant, opportunistic power grab disguised as righteous outrage. Valerius wasn't a fool. He knew he couldn't win a direct fight, but with the high priest whipping the common folk into a frenzy, he could create enough chaos to shatter Darius's authority. He wants a civil war, Darius whispered, the words tasting like ash. His kingdom, which he had held together for 5 long years through grief and duty, was about to tear itself apart. All because she had come back. He felt a despair so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. For a moment he was paralyzed. The weight of the crown, of the mob, of the impending war, pressed down on him. What was he to do? Sacrifice her to save his kingdom? The thought was a physical violation, a blade twisting in his soul. He had already lost her once. He could not do it again. Ronan watched him, his face etched with worry. What are your orders, Alpha? Darius looked past his beta, back to the woman lying on the divan. He saw the soft blue of her gown, the silver of her hair against the dark fur. As he watched, a faint rosy blush began to creep into her cheeks, a touch of color returning to her lips. His gambit had worked. He had given her a foothold, a spark. Life was returning. The choice was no choice at all. Let the kingdom burn. My orders are the same, Darius said, his voice regaining its strength, its iron certainty. The Blood Guard hold this wing. Send word to General Cail. Have him muster the legions outside the city walls and wait for my command. We will surround the city if we have to. Valerius wants a war. He will have one. The high priest wants a demon. I will show him the wrath of a king. He turned his back on Ronan and the chaos of the world outside. He walked back to Oren's side, his path suddenly, terrifyingly clear. He was her king, but before that, he was her mate. He knelt beside her once more, his resolve hardening into something unbreakable. He reached for her hand. Her skin was no longer marble cold. It was cool, like the air after a spring rain, but the deathly chill was gone. As his fingers closed around hers, her eyelids fluttered. He held his breath. Slowly, her eyes opened. They were not the clear silver gray he remembered. They were luminous, glowing with a soft internal light, the color of moss and wet stone after a storm. And they were not focused on him. They were staring up at the stone ceiling as if seeing something far beyond it. A whisper, rough and fragile, escaped her lips, the first word she had spoken since she collapsed. The stone is hungry. Her fingers, which had been limp in his, suddenly tightened, her grip impossibly strong, trapping his hand in hers. Her grip was iron. Not the strength of a warrior, which he knew so well, but something elemental and unyielding, like the roots of an ancient tree clinging to rock. Her glowing eyes were not looking at him, but through him, through the very floor of the castle, seeing something in the deep foundations that he could only guess at. The stone is hungry. The words made no sense, yet they resonated with a chilling absolute truth. The castle, which had been his family's seat of power for a millennium, suddenly felt alien, a vast living creature stirring from a long slumber. Oren, he said, his voice a low command, trying to break through the strange trance. Look at me. Her head turned slowly, the luminous moss-green eyes finally focusing on his face. The pressure on his hand eased, but she did not release him. Her gaze was unnervingly perceptive, as if she could see the frantic beating of his heart, the war between king and mate raging within him. Ronan, who had been frozen by the door, took a hesitant step forward. "My king?" he whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. The intrusion broke the spell. Darius remembered the mob, the coup, the kingdom teetering on the edge of a blade. He tore his gaze from Oren, the effort feeling like ripping away a part of himself. He looked at his beta, and the king returned, his voice cold and hard as the iron of his crown. "Ronan, you have your orders. Go. Bar the doors to the royal wing. Use the blood guard. They are sworn to me, not to the priesthood or the council. Hold this corridor until Kyle's legions arrive, or until the world ends. Let no one pass." "And Lord Valerius?" Ronan asked, his jaw tight. "He has declared himself a traitor. If his men try to breach this wing, you will treat them as such. Show no quarter." The command was ruthless, a sentence of death. But the time for diplomacy was over. Valerius had chosen his path. Ronan's eyes flickered to Oren, a question in them. Darius gave a sharp, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "She is not to be a part of this fight. She is to be protected." Ronan understood. He bowed his head, a swift, sharp gesture of loyalty. "As you command, Alpha." He turned and was gone, the heavy solar door booming shut behind him, the sound of the great iron bolt being thrown, echoing like a drumbeat of war. They were alone again, sealed in the heart of the storm. The distant muffled roar of the mob was a low hum, a beast growling outside their sanctuary. Darius turned back to Oren. The immediacy of the threat had cleared his mind, honing it to a fine point. "What did you mean?" he demanded, his voice softer now, but no less urgent. "The stone is hungry. What stone?" She finally let go of his hand, her own falling to her side. She pushed herself into a sitting position on the divan, her movements stiff at first, then imbued with a strange, fluid grace. She looked small in his large solar, a fragile figure in a borrowed gown, yet the power radiating from her made the very air feel dense. "Not a stone," she whispered, her voice gaining a little more strength, the rasp of the grave smoothing into something clearer, more resonant. "The stone, the heart of the mountain, the foundation upon which this castle, this kingdom, was built." She lifted a hand, tracing a pattern in the air. "Your ancestor, Halwyn I, did not conquer this land. He made a bargain with it. He bound his bloodline to the heart of the mountain in exchange for its strength, its endurance." Darius stared at her, the old legends and fireside tales of his childhood suddenly taking on a terrifying new meaning. The Heartstone was spoken of in the oldest texts, a myth, a metaphor for the strength of their line. "That's a children's story," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "All stories are true for those who are forced to live them," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "The prophecy, it was the price of that bargain. The bond between the Alpha King and his true Luna is the conduit. It feeds the stone, keeps the bargain alive, and anchors the land's power to your blood. Our bond, Darius. It was meant to be the strongest in 1,000 years. A feast for the stone." Her words painted a horrifying picture. Their love, their fated bond, had not been a gift from the goddess, but a tithe to be paid to some ancient slumbering power. "But the prophecy claimed my strength would be sealed when my mate was given to the earth," he argued, clinging to the version of the story that had haunted him for 5 years. A sad, knowing look entered her eyes. "Given, not taken," she corrected gently. "It was a fail-safe. If the bond were ever threatened with being broken, the earth would act as a vessel. It would hold the Luna in stasis, preserving the connection, however faint, until the danger passed." She looked at him, and he saw no accusation in her eyes, only a deep, profound sorrow. "When you stood at that altar, preparing to sever our bond forever by swearing yourself to another, the land panicked. The stone began to starve. It had no choice but to send me back." The truth of it settled in his bones, a cold, heavy weight. His act of duty, his attempt to move on and secure the kingdom, had been the very thing that imperiled it. He had nearly starved the ancient power that held it all together. He had broken a promise not just to her, but to the very land he ruled. He sank to his knees before her. The king finally undone. He reached out, his hands finding hers, clasping them tightly. Her skin was still cool, but the warmth he had pushed into her was there, a flickering ember he had ignited. "Oren," he breathed, his throat tight. "Forgive me." She brought one of his hands to her cheek, pressing his knuckles against her cool skin. He could feel the fine silver root scars beneath his fingers. "There is nothing to forgive," she said. And for the first time, a shadow of the old Oren, his Oren, was in her voice. "You mourned. You suffered. I felt it, even in the dark. It was a cold, lonely song that kept me from forgetting." She leaned forward, her scent enveloping him, roses, earth, and now something new, the clean, sharp smell of rain on stone. "And you," she whispered, her glowing eyes searching his. "What is this new scar you wear?" Her free hand came up, her cool fingers gently tracing the line of a faint, silvery scar that ran from his temple down his cheek, disappearing into his beard. It was a wound from a border skirmish 2 years ago, a trivial thing he barely remembered receiving. But her touch was not trivial. As her fingers followed the line of healed flesh, a jolt went through him, and for a heartbeat, he felt not the pain of the blade, but the deep, aching loneliness of the night he'd received it, the hollow victory, the empty return to a cold bed. She was not just touching the scar, she was reading it, feeling the story of its creation. "How?" he began, but she shook her head. "I am part of the earth now, Darius, and you are part of me. Your story is written on you, and I can read the words." Her gaze was intense, full of a fierce, possessive love that was both familiar and terrifyingly new. 5 years of words. A shattering crash from the corridor ripped them apart. It was the sound of heavy oak splintering, followed by a war cry and the clash of steel on steel. The mob, or Valerius's men, had breached the first door. Ronan's voice roared a command, and the sounds of battle erupted, sharp and brutal, just beyond their chamber. Darius was on his feet in an instant, the warrior, the king, taking over. He spun around, his eyes locking on the great sword that rested on its stand by the hearth. He would die here, in this room, before he let anyone lay a hand on her. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice the alpha's growl. He took a step toward the sword, but her hand shot out, grabbing his arm. Her grip was iron once more. "No," she said, her voice low and resonant with a power that vibrated through the floor. She rose to her feet, not with the weakness of an invalid, but with the fluid grace of a river current. She was no longer a small, fragile thing. As she stood, the air in the room grew heavy, charged with ozone. The flames in the hearth leaped and danced, casting wild, elongated shadows. The single perfect rose on the floor, which had been a lone crimson petal, suddenly bloomed wide open, every petal unfurling in a silent, breathtaking display of life. She walked past him, her bare feet silent on the stone. She did not head for the safety of the adjoining room, but walked directly toward the great solar door, toward the sounds of battle and the fury of the mob. "Oren, no!" he shouted, moving to intercept her, to pull her back. She stopped and looked at him over her shoulder. The glow in her eyes was no longer soft. It was a blazing emerald fire. A faint smile touched her lips, a dangerous, feral thing. "You do not understand, my love," she said, her voice now a force of nature, like the wind before a storm. "The high priest is right. They have come for a monster." Her gaze flicked toward the door, through which he could now hear the splintering of wood and the terrified screams of men. "The stone is hungry. It demands a tithe of blood and fear to restore the balance." She turned to face the door fully, raising her hands. The silver root-like scars on her skin began to glow, a web of brilliant, terrifying light. They have come to feed it. The ancient oak door of the solar did not splinter. It exploded. A shockwave of raw, physical force blew the door inward, not as planks and shattered beams, but as a cloud of wooden shrapnel. Darius instinctively threw himself in front of Oren, shielding her with his body as the deadly splinters whistled past them, embedding themselves in the tapestries and stone walls behind. The sounds of battle in the corridor abruptly ceased, replaced by a stunned, terrified silence. Through the gaping, ruined doorway stood Lord Valerius, his face a mask of triumphant fury. He was flanked by a dozen of his best men-at-arms, their swords dripping with the blood of the blood guard who had failed to hold the line. Behind them, pressing into the corridor, was the vanguard of the mob, a sea of contorted, fanatical faces lit by the hellish orange glow of torches. At the very front of the crowd, his white robes stained with soot, and spattered with blood, was the high priest, his eyes wild with righteous madness. "Behold!" the high priest shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria as he pointed a trembling finger past Darius. "The demon wears the Luna's face. See how the king shields it. He is corrupted. He has forsaken us all." A venomous roar of agreement rose from the crowd. They surged forward, a wave of hate and fear. Valerius raised a hand, his lips curled into a smug, victorious sneer. "It is over, Halwyn," he spat, his voice ringing with false authority. "Your reign is at an end. Surrender the creature to the priest for cleansing, and abdicate your throne. Do this, and my daughter might still persuade me to grant you a quick and merciful death." Darius felt a laugh, a harsh, humorless bark of pure rage, bubble up in his chest. He straightened slowly, turning his back on Auron, facing the enemy that had breached his sanctuary. He was unarmed, protected only by the fine wool of his tunic, yet he stood as if clad in impenetrable steel. His eyes, the color of a stormy winter sky, swept over them all, Valerius, the priest, the mob, and they saw not a broken king, but an alpha preparing to kill. "You dare," he said, his voice a low, lethal whisper that carried to every corner of the hall, silencing the mob's rabble. "You dare to spill the blood of my guard in my own halls. You dare to threaten my mate. You dare to speak of my throne." His gaze settled on Valerius, and the full, crushing weight of his alpha command descended. "You have bought your death 1,000 times over tonight, Valerius, and I will enjoy collecting the debt." For a second, fear flickered in Valerius's eyes. The sheer, primal authority in Darius's voice made his soldiers hesitate, their sword arms wavering. The mob shuffled, the front ranks pushing back against the press of bodies behind them. But the high priest, lost in his divine fervor, was immune. "Do not listen to the demon tongue," he screamed. "She has ensnared him. Cleanse this place with fire, burn the witch, burn the corrupted king." The word fire was a spark in a powder keg. The mob's fear ignited back into fury. A torch flew through the air, sailing over Darius's head. He didn't flinch, didn't even turn, his eyes still locked on Valerius. The torch landed on the wolf pelt divan, where Auron had lain just moments before. The dry fur and oils caught instantly, erupting in a whoosh of greasy, black smoke and hungry orange flames. The firelight threw their shadows, monstrous and dancing, against the walls. That was when Auron moved. She stepped out from behind him. Her movement was so silent, so fluid, he barely registered it until she was beside him. The firelight caught in her hair, turning the silver strands to molten metal. The glow in her eyes was now a blinding emerald inferno. The silver root-like scars on her skin blazed with light, no longer faint tracings but a brilliant, searing web of power that pulsed in time. With a heartbeat that wasn't her own, a collective gasp went through the crowd. This was not the pale, confused woman from the Septi. This was not a victim to be pitied or a ghost to be feared. This was a goddess of vengeance, ancient and terrible. "You speak of fire," she said, and her voice was no longer a whisper. It was the deep, resonant groan of shifting tectonic plates, the sound of the earth itself finding its voice. It filled the hall, vibrated in the stone under their feet, and thrummed in the bones of every person present. "You are children playing with matches in a forest you do not understand." She raised a hand, not toward the mob, but toward the stone floor. She curled her fingers into a fist. The floor beneath Lord Valerius and his men cracked. It was not a tremor, but a deliberate, focused act of will. Thick, gray vines, the color and texture of wet stone, erupted from the fissures. They were not living plants. They were extensions of the castle itself, animated by her command. They moved with terrifying speed, whipping through the air like serpents, wrapping around the ankles and legs of Valerius's soldiers. Men screamed as they were dragged down, their armor scraping uselessly against the floor. The stone vines constricted, and the horrifying sound of snapping bones echoed in the sudden, shocked silence. Valerius cried out in alarm and rage, slashing at a vine with his sword. The blade sparked against the stone-like surface and bounced off, leaving not even a scratch. The vine whipped around his sword arm, yanking the weapon from his grasp, before coiling around his chest, pinning his arms to his sides and lifting him several inches off the floor, leaving him dangling and helpless. Auron paid him no mind. Her blazing eyes were fixed on the high priest. "You wish to feed your god," she said. her voice dropping to a chillingly calm tone. "But it is my God who is hungry tonight." She took a step forward. With every step she took, the silver scars on her skin flared brighter, and the stone vines grew thicker, more numerous, erupting from the floor and even the walls, a forest of grasping, writhing tendrils that sealed the corridor. The mob, which had been a roaring beast moments before, was now a panicked herd, trampling each other in a desperate attempt to flee from a horror they could not comprehend. The high priest stood his ground, his face a mask of terror and ecstatic faith. "Begone, demon!" he shrieked, holding up the gilded symbol of his office as if it were a shield. "By the light of the moon goddess, I command you." Orin stopped directly in front of him. A slow, pitying smile touched her lips. "Your goddess has no power here," she whispered. "This is the earth's domain, and the earth remembers its debts." She reached out, her fingers gently touching the holy symbol. The moment her skin made contact, the polished gold blackened and corroded, crumbling into dust that rained down onto the floor. The priest stared at his empty hand, his mouth opening and closing silently, his faith shattered into a million pieces. "You spoke of cleansing," Orin continued, her voice soft, hypnotic. "Of purification." She placed her hand on his chest. The priest shuddered, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. He did not burn. He did not bleed. But the vibrant color drained from his face, from his robes, from his very being. His skin turned a sickly, ashen gray. His eyes dulled. The life force was being drawn out of him. A silent, terrifying feast. He aged a century in a single heartbeat, his body withering, his robes hanging loosely on a suddenly skeletal frame. When she finally pulled her hand away, he crumpled to the floor, not a man, but a dry, weightless husk. Darius watched, frozen. He was witnessing power on a scale he had never imagined. This was not the work of a wolf, or a witch, or even a demon. This was the raw, untamed will of the land itself, channeled through the woman he loved. The awe was quickly being replaced by a cold, creeping dread. He had wanted her back, had prayed for it, had railed at the gods for taking her. But the woman who had come back from the grave was not the one he had lost. He had lost a warrior. The earth had returned a force of nature. His Orin was gone, and this terrifying, beautiful, powerful being stood in her place. The thought was a betrayal, but it was also the truth, and it broke him in a way Valerius's army never could. He had fought to protect a memory, and in doing so, had unleashed a god. Orin seemed to feel the shift in him. With the last of her enemies either dead, dying, or fled, she turned her gaze back to him. The emerald fire in her eyes softened. The blazing light of her scars dimmed to a soft, silvery pulse. The stone vines receded back into the floor, leaving the broken bodies of Valerius's men in their wake. Valerius himself was dropped in a heap, bound and gasping for air. The roaring fire on the divan was the only sound in the now silent room. "Darius," she said, and her voice was just a voice again, holding all the love and pain of their shared past. He looked at her, at the impossible power she wielded, at the life she had just extinguished with a touch, at the smirking traitor she had crushed without effort. He looked at the smoking ruin of his solar and the corpses in his hall. The king in him saw the cost of this victory, a kingdom ruled by fear of a power it could never understand. The man in him saw the chasm that had opened between them, a gulf wider and deeper than any grave. He had begged for a miracle, and he had received one. But now, faced with the terrifying reality of it, he had to make a choice, not as a king, but as a man. Could he love this? Could he kneel to this power, even if it wore the face of his wife? "What have you become?" he whispered. And the words were not an accusation, but a plea. It was the sound of a heart breaking for the second time. The snow fell softly on the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, a silent white benediction on a land that had healed. 5 years had passed since the night the castle stone had bled and the dead Luna had reclaimed her kingdom. 5 years since Darius had stood in the ashes of his solar and asked a question that had reshaped his world. He stood now on the same sun-warmed boulder where he had once sparred with a girl crowned in wild roses. The air was crisp and cold, smelling of pine and the clean, sharp scent of impending winter. Below him, the valley stretched out, a patchwork of fallow fields and deep green forests, peaceful under the heavy gray sky. His kingdom was prosperous, his people were safe, and they were terrified of their queen. He had not abandoned her, he had not exiled her. When faced with the chasm between them, he had chosen not to leap across it, nor to turn his back on it, but to build a bridge. He had stood before his terrified court the next morning, the bound and broken Lord Valerius at his feet, and had not explained, not justified, but simply declared. Orin was his Luna, returned by the will of the ancient powers that governed their land. Her word was his word. Her authority was his authority. To defy her was to defy the very earth upon which they stood. It was not a speech that inspired love. It was a command that ensured survival. And so they had ruled. A strange dual monarchy of iron and earth. He was the king, the tangible hand of justice and law, the commander of armies, and the adjudicator of disputes. She was the Luna, the queen, but more than that. She was the whisper in the wind, the strength in the stone, the unseen force that ensured the rains came on time, and the harvests were bountiful. The common folk left offerings for her at the base of ancient stones, not out of love, but out of a deep, reverent fear. They spoke her name in hushed tones. The priests, those who were left, had rewritten their holy text to include the primacy of the Earth Mother, a goddess who wore their queen's face. It was a lonely peace. Their life together was a quiet, careful dance. He had moved them from the main castle keep to a secluded tower that overlooked the oldest part of the forest. The stone there was ancient, and it seemed to soothe her. At night, they lay together in a bed carved from a single, massive oak, and he would hold her, offering his warmth against the perpetual coolness of her skin. He had learned to pour his strength into her not in desperate bursts, but in a slow, steady current, an endless transfusion of life that kept the abyss at bay and the glow in her eyes soft. In return, she would read the stories of his day from the lines on his hands and the weariness in his bones, offering a silent, profound understanding that no words could ever match. They loved each other, he was certain of that. The bond between them was a strange, tangled, beautiful thing, part human love, part primal bargain. But the easy laughter, the shared jokes, the simple, uncomplicated joy of their past, that was a ghost that haunted their quiet halls. He had gotten his wife back, but he had lost his companion. He ruled beside a goddess, not the girl who had cheated at sparring and laughed in the wind. A twig snapped behind him. He didn't have to turn. He knew her scent, the impossible mix of roses and cold, damp earth that was now as familiar to him as his own. "Your thoughts are loud today, my king," she said. Her voice, once a rasp, was now as smooth and clear as water flowing over river stones. He turned. She stood a few feet away, wrapped in a simple cloak of gray wool that matched her eyes. She wore no crown, no jewels. She needed none. Her authority was in the way the wind seemed to quiet in her presence, the way a curious fox paused at the edge of the trees to watch her, unafraid. "I was remembering," he said, his voice a low rumble. She came to stand beside him on the boulder, her hip brushing against his. "The girl with the rose crown," she stated, not a question. She could feel his memories, taste them on the air between them. "Do you miss her?" It was the question that lay unspoken between them every single day, the heart of his quiet sorrow. He looked at her, at the face he loved more than his own life, at the silver-gray eyes that held the wisdom of mountains and the chill of the grave. He could lie. He could say that he wanted nothing more than what he had. But their bond was too deep for lies. "Every day," he answered, and the honesty of it was a raw, aching thing. "I love you, Orin, more than I thought it was possible to love anything. But I miss my wife." She did not flinch. She did not look away. A flicker of something ancient and sad passed through her eyes. She reached out, her cool hand finding his, her fingers lacing with his warm ones. "I miss her too," she whispered, and the confession stole the breath from his lungs. "I have her memories. I have her love for you, a fire that kept me anchored in the dark. But I do not have her lightness. The earth took that as part of its price. It gave me power, but it cost me the sun." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a rare and precious gesture. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. For a long moment, they just stood there, two lonely monarchs on a mountain peak, sharing a grief for a woman they both had lost. "The bargain your ancestor made," he said finally, his voice thick. Is the price always this high? The bond must be fed, she answered softly, her voice muffled against his cloak. With love, with life. Ours was an emergency. A debt called in with violence. It unbalanced the scales. Her head lifted and she looked out over the valley. But the scales can be rebalanced. A new bond, a new promise. One given freely, not taken by force. His heart constricted. He knew what she was implying. A child, an heir, the continuation of the bloodline. They had never spoken of it. He had assumed it was impossible, that the coldness of the grave had left her barren. Is it possible? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. She turned to face him fully, her hands coming up to cup his face. Her touch was cool, but her gaze was warm, and for the first time in 5 years, he saw not a goddess, not a revenant, but Oren, his Oren. The fierce, determined light he had fallen in love with was shining there, a flame rekindled in the depths of her soul. The earth is a mother, Darius, she said, her voice full of a gentle, powerful certainty. It does not take without giving. It has taken much from us, but it can give too, a new life, one that is not a payment, but a gift, a child of both worlds, of your son and my stone, a new beginning for the land and for us. He stared at her, seeing the future she was offering him. Not a return to the past, he knew that was impossible, but a new path forward, a way to build something new from the ruins of what they had lost. A child, a family, a reason for the sun to touch their lives again. Tears pricked at his eyes, the first he had allowed himself to shed since the night he had buried her. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. The chasm between them was still there, a testament to their scars, to their loss. But for the first time, he felt the bridge they had built was strong enough to hold them. Not just as a king and his queen, but as a man and his wife. He kissed her, and it was not a kiss of desperate memory or sorrowful duty. It was a kiss of promise. Her lips were cool, but he poured all his warmth, all his hope, all his love into it, and he felt a responding warmth from her, a faint but undeniable flicker of the sun returning to her soul. When they parted, a single perfect snowflake landed on her cheek, a tear of ice from the sky. He brushed it away with his thumb. "Then let us go home," he said, and together they walked down from the lonely heights, leaving the ghosts of the past behind them, their hands clasped tightly as they went, to greet the uncertain, hopeful future. The wild roses that grew along the path, which should have been withered and dead in the coming frost, were in full, impossible bloom.